Let me start out with a little audience participation here. Again, we're at a lifestyle conference. So how many of you feel reasonably well qualified to talk to people about the health benefits of physical activity? Come on, don't be shy. There we go. How about healthy diet and nutrition and healthy sleep? That is awesome, okay? And I have to admit that I'm surprised because I pitched this talk to try to convince you of why sleep belongs at this table. I'm not going to alter that, but it's good to know that I'm not going to have to do as hard a job at selling. So these are my conflicts in case anyone has questions about these. I'm going to begin by preaching to the choir. You all know what it is that kills us, right? It's obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, substance use, depression, and suicide, right? And this has already been emphasized today, but just ripped from the headlines here, we know that mortality rates in the U.S. are increasing across all age groups. And it's worth saying that here in Western Pennsylvania, we are at the very epicenter of those trends. So this is not only a timely conference, but a geographically sensitive one as well. I think we know as well that if we look at those causes of mortality, that there may be certain biological mechanisms that are common to many of those causes of mortality as well. And if we go further upstream, of course, we have our behavior. Poor eating, physical inactivity, excessive drinking, risk-taking, and maybe, I would add to that, excessive light at night. But are there organizing principles that are even further upstream? Are there biological processes that help to unite all of these health behaviors that are so important to us all? And I would argue that sleep and wakefulness are among those behaviors, and that exists within an even larger context of the 24-hour rhythms that organize almost every aspect of our physiology. So why is that? Why should it be that 24-hour rhythms or sleep are so important to our health? I think to answer that, you have to go back, way back, to the fact that we live on a rotating planet. This is supposed to rotate. Sorry, I had a PowerPoint glitch. Looks even better when it rotates. But we live on a planet that rotates on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour, circling once every 24 hours and creating regular cycles of light and dark that we all live in. So we have not only adaptation to physical environments during the course of evolution, but we have adaptations to temporal niches as well. So it's no exaggeration to say that every living creature, at least near the surface of Earth, really lives in two worlds, a world of light and a world of darkness. That has pretty profound implications for our biology. So the question is, how does our biology adapt to that physical reality? How do we essentially get the physical environment of a rotating globe into our heads and into our bodies? That's what I'd like to talk about this morning to kick off this section. The fact is that life is rhythmic. From every time frame that we can look at, we can find examples of how biology varies in a rhythmic fashion. Today we're going to be talking mostly about circadian or 24-hour rhythms, and a lot of the mechanisms that underlie circadian rhythms apply as well to those short-term rhythms, ultradian rhythms that characterize our biology, as well as the longer-term rhythms, ultradian rhythms. At the very basis of our rhythmicity is the fact that we represent the 24-hour day in our cells. Every cell has a circadian clock, and without going into detail, I'll just say that it rests on a transcription, translation, feedback pathway involving 9 core clock genes that regulate their own transcription every 24 hours and are affected by things like the light-dark cycle. Now, because the clock is a genetic mechanism, that means that it's present in every cell and tissue of our body. We do have a sort of master pacemaker, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. It's well situated right above the optic chiasm to receive light-dark inputs, okay? So it allows us to generate rhythms that are tied to the physical world. But the key point is that our rhythmicity doesn't come from the external world. It comes from within ourselves. If you look at almost anything that you can measure in a human being, it will show a circadian rhythm. A couple examples here: core body temperature and cortisol rhythms, right? We think of 98.6 as being normal temperature, but that's not really true. Our temperature varies systematically across the time of day. And you may say, well, of course our temperature drops at night because we're asleep and we're not physically active, so our temperature is just going to drop. And it's really just it's an effect of sleep, but it's not really a rhythm. Except that when you take away sleep in certain experimental paradigms called a constant routine, you see that body temperature continues to cycle with a 24-hour rhythm. You see that cortisol continues to cycle even when people are at bed rest for 24 hours. So these are endogenous rhythms. And they're not just for our physiology either. They're also present in neurobehavioral performance. You can take almost any task that you administer to a person. If you give it to them repeatedly across the 24-hour day, what you'll find is that human performance typically is worse near the time when our core body temperature is lowest, when our melatonin is highest. We have a number of ways of measuring circadian rhythms. You can ask people about their preference for evening or morning hours, or so-called chronotype. You can measure activity patterns with things like your Fitbit tracker, your Apple Watch. You can see when people are active and inactive. Actually, this particular example is a person who is living on about a 26-hour day, even though they're in the real world, so that's kind of an unusual thing. We can measure physiology, as I mentioned, through plasma melatonin and a variety of other things. You can get an idea of where a person's time is. And you can even measure circadian rhythms in cultured tissue. So you can take pieces of heart, lung, kidney, you can put them in a plate, and you can measure circadian rhythms that will continue autonomously for several cycles thereafter. So what are these 24-hour rhythms good for? Well, just to take one example, these are some elegant studies conducted by John Hoganish and colleagues, and they looked at the human genome and gene expression and found substantial overlap between genes that show 24-hour variation and those genes that we know are associated with a whole host of diseases, as well as genes that are drug targets, okay? So the very genes that may contribute to illness, that may contribute to drug effects, are genes that cycle on a 24-hour day. Why is that important? Well, one example that these investigators provided is that COX-1 gene, which is a target of aspirin, shows robust circadian variation. And considering that aspirin has a half-life of only 6 hours, it matters when you give that if your goal is to prevent cardiovascular disease, right? And it turns out that a microRNA that targets the gene product of COX-1 also shows circadian variation. So the implication here is that circadian variation of genes is not only important for disease, but also important for our therapeutics of those diseases. One other important point to make is that the circadian timing system receives feedback regulation. These clocks in our brain and our cells regulate brain function, they regulate body function, and brain and body functions are what determines our physiology, behavior, and performance, and all of the key health behaviors that we're talking about today. There's circadian variation in physical activity, in sleep, in our interaction with light and dark stimuli, and in our eating. And it turns out that the timing of each of those behaviors provides feedback control to the central clock and to the peripheral clocks in every one of our cells. So how we behave literally changes the timing of the clock, and the clock affects all of the health behaviors that lead to disease. The sleep-wake cycle is the most enduring and obvious manifestation of the circadian timing system. We have here Cassiopeia, a jellyfish that has no central nervous system, in fact, no nervous system to speak of. it shows a rest activity cycle. C. elegans, a worm, Drosophila, the fruit fly. These have been some of the models that have been at the core of circadian and sleep research because those organisms have the same clock genes that people do. Okay, so this is a very, very ancient biological mechanism. So we can define sleep in our nerdy sleep people way, but we all sort of know what sleep is. The real question is, what is sleep good for? What is the function of sleep? And we could have endless philosophical debates about that. I will just say that from what we know, whatever sleep is ultimately good for, it's certainly true that it optimizes function at every level of biological organization, from molecules to whole organisms. Everything is better when the organism is allowed to have its rest activity cycle or sleep. And when you take sleep away, there's a deterioration of function at every one of those levels as well. I'd like to show you a few examples. So we can measure sleep again by self-report. We can measure it with actigraphy. We can measure it physiologically, electrophysiologically with sleep studies, and we can even measure it with imaging. So there are a variety of tools available to look at how sleep may influence health. So what is sleep good for then? If we look in the CNS, one of the things we've learned in the past 10 years or so is that it's good for clearing the brain of the garbage that accumulates during wakefulness. So if you instill tracers into the CSF, you see that these protein tracers are cleared at a much greater rate during sleep than during wakefulness. The observation are that natural sleep and anesthesia result in this increased clearance of CSF interstitial spaces via something called the glymphatic system, kind of like a lymphatic system for your brain. And that glymphatic system seems to turn on and become more active specifically during sleep. What it does is that it clears beta amyloid and other proteins that we don't want hanging around our brain. So in young, healthy adults, we have robust glymphatic clearance of all these proteins. As we age, the glymphatic clearance is reduced, leading to the accumulation of beta amyloid and other proteins. And in Alzheimer's disease, which, by the way, is marked by severe sleep-wake and circadian dysregulation, we see greater accumulation of these proteins, in part because they're not effectively being cleared during sleep. What else is good sleep for? What else is sleep good for? Well, this is work done in fruit flies at Columbia, and they had this hypothesis that sleep would be good for dealing with oxidative stress. So what they did is that they identified several mutant mice that have reduced amounts of sleep. So the left columns in each case is the amount of sleep, and you can see they had 3 different mutants called sleepless, fumin, and red eye. Cute. And then they subjected these flies to oxidative stress, such as paraquat administration or hydrogen peroxide. And what you see is that the sleep-deficient mice had increased mortality compared to wild-type mice, or flies, rather. So in each case, regardless of the specific mutation that led to decreased sleep was associated with increased mortality. Another hot area of research recently is to examine the relationship between sleep, circadian rhythms, and metabolism. So the lines of evidence are several and all pretty interesting. One is that food actually entrains circadian rhythms. You can shift someone's timing or a mouse's timing on the basis of when you give it food. And it does that through a mechanism that's outside of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the light-sensitive part of your brain. So just the appearance of food, you can shift mice's entire schedule by when you feed them. Moreover, clock gene mutations, so circadian mutations, become obese in mice. We also know that the molecular clock is tied to the molecular circadian and metabolic clocks are directly tied to each other. And they are tied through various molecular transmitters and through epigenetic modification. Moreover, the cellular energetics are affected by the organism's sleep-wake schedule, and things like light-dark exposure and physical activity directly affect activity of the circadian molecular clock as well. To make the story even more interesting, we know that in both animal and humans, that eating at inappropriate times of day in the circadian system leads to changes in food intake, and in the absence of changes in food intake, to changes in weight. So if you take mice, give them a high-fat diet at their expected eating time, they'll gain weight. If you give them a high-fat diet at the wrong time of day, they gain weight at a much greater rate than the appropriately fed animals. And it's been observed in humans as well that humans who consume a large amount of their calories at night tend to be more obese and to gain more weight. We also know from experimental studies that sleep restriction increases appetite, reduces insulin sensitivity, and conversely that time-restricted feeding can prevent obesity in animal models and even lead to weight loss. So if we move now kind of from the laboratory to the clinic and the real world, there have been two main perspectives on how sleep may be related to health. One is to consider various sleep disorders that you see here. I'm just going to say a very quick word about this, and I think Pat Strollo is going to say a little bit more. The other thing is to consider, outside of whether or not you have a sleep disorder, just what is your sleep pattern? What are your sleep characteristics? How regular is your sleep? How alert are you during the day? Is your sleep appropriately timed? Is it highly efficient? Is it of sufficient duration? And when you look at health and wellness from either of those perspectives, we see that sleep is related to health or conversely to disease. Just a couple of examples here. So obstructive sleep apnea is known to be associated with health risks, largely cardiovascular risk. This is one example of longitudinal data from the Sleep Heart Health study showing that people who had a higher apnea-hypopnea index, that is a higher number of apnea events at night, had increased mortality, and it did so in an apparent dose-response relationship. But sleep apnea is also associated with cardiometabolic risk and neuropsychiatric risk as well. I think the key things that we still need to know is how to best measure the severity of sleep apnea so that we can measure the effect of treatment on health outcomes. The apnea-hypopnea index has turned out not to be a great metric for actually observing the kind of treatment effects that we believe are there. Take another example of a sleep disorder, insomnia. The thing that we can certainly say about insomnia now is that having insomnia is associated with increased risk for subsequent depression, even in people who do not have depression to start with. So this is a meta-analysis of several studies that showed people with insomnia have twice the risk for developing depression as people without insomnia. And to extend that story a little bit, we also know that something as simple as sleep duration in adolescence is associated with risk for suicidal behaviors, right? So we see a U-shaped relationship here such that kids who sleep very short amounts or conversely very long amounts have increased risk of all sorts of suicidal behaviors. Now, my colleagues and I are kind of interested in this notion of multidimensional sleep health just because this is something that applies to every person at every time, right? You don't have to have a sleep disorder for sleep to be important to you. And what we found is that when you measure sleep in this multidimensional way, it's related to all sorts of health outcomes that matter. And it's related to them in teens through older adults. It's related in both cross-sectional and in longitudinal follow-up studies. So I hope I'm convincing you that sleep and circadian rhythms are important for health. And the next question then should be, what, if anything, can we do about it, right? And how might that affect people who are interested in lifestyle modification to improve health? So the way that a sleep and circadian guy looks at it is kind of like this, that we have a circadian timing system that influences and regulates and receives feedback control from all of the important health risk behaviors. And those behaviors change our physiology to result in health outcomes. We also know that there are a lot of modifiers at each step along the way, genes, environment, social interactions. But I think the really interesting question for us is whether we can use our knowledge of the circadian timing system to change those health behaviors, acting through known mechanisms to optimize our health. Now, already today we've talked about a number of interventions for physical activity, for eating, I can tell you there are such interventions for sleep as well. But to me, again, the interesting question is not whether interventions exist for each of those behaviors, but whether we can intervene on the circadian timing system to influence all of them simultaneously. So what might such an intervention look like? Well, some of my colleagues and I have been playing around with an intervention that we're calling clockwork for the time being. And our notion is that we really want to address all of the major health risk behaviors from a circadian perspective. And in doing so, then, we would pay attention not only to what you eat or how much you eat, but when you eat it and how regularly. We would pay attention not only to how much you sleep, but when you sleep and whether that schedule is regular. And the same for physical activity and when you are exposed to light and dark cues in the environment. So we call this kind of the art of clockwork, paying attention to the amount, the regularity, and the timing of each of those key health behaviors. And you could sort of imagine an intervention that focuses kind of block by block on each of the key health behaviors, but emphasizes the circadian principles that underlie each of them together. One final thing I'd like to mention is that when we talk about behavioral interventions, whether they're circadian or any of the other interventions we've been talking about today, that those interventions can be approached from different levels of organization, from the individual to society. So, for instance, sleep and circadian health interventions have largely been focused on individuals, one person at a time. And they can be effective, but it's very inefficient. And I think that we would have to agree that's the case for our physical activity and eating interventions as well. It's not that they don't work, it's just that going person by person is a very arduous task. So are there ways of developing family and group-based interventions, web-based social support to extend the reach of this? I know that in the case of sleep interventions, again, there are a number of web-based interventions that are quite effective. But we also need to think bigger in terms of getting communities on board, social networks, and yes, the built environment relevant to sleep and circadian issues as well as all the others we've heard about today. And even at the level of public policy and cultural leadership. Take one example here from the sleep and circadian field. There's a large push now to change school start times for high school students. And why is that? Well, it's because the biology of adolescence pushes your circadian rhythms to a later time, and yet we as a society have decided it would be a good idea to push school start times to an earlier time. The result is that our teens are literally flying in their brain from California to New York every weekend to get back on their school schedule, okay? So at a societal level, what makes sense is to have school start times later in adolescence and earlier for our younger kids, but that is not an easy change to make. It is an illustrative example, though, of how this could be done. So my research agenda, then, is from basic science perspective, I think there's a lot more that we have to learn about circadian and sleep-related control of gene expression and regulation. This story about lymphatic clearance in the CNS is still at its relatively early stages. And I didn't talk much about this, but we know that sleep is restorative for the brain and the body, but we don't really know much about what that means. And we need to know more about that. In a translational science perspective, I've told you that we have these circadian rhythms. What I also have to tell you is that although we can measure them in the lab, we don't have a practical way of identifying when someone is in the real world, right? I can ask you how you are, but I can't determine when you are in terms of the timing of your circadian system. And we need to know that if we want to have circadian-focused interventions. As I talked about, there's a lot to learn about the effect of circadian rhythms on common therapeutics. And there's much more to be learned about how circadian rhythms and sleep interact with metabolism at all different levels of organization. Finally, on the clinical and implementation science side, I think we need novel measures to identify the relationships between sleep disorders, sleep treatments, and health outcomes. We are at the beginning stages of disseminating some simple behavioral sleep interventions for things like insomnia, but we have more to go. And as I've argued, I think that we need some novel sleep and circadian interventions that focus at both the individual, community, and societal levels. So I think I will stop there, and we'll have the panelists come up. Thank you.
You know, I think one of the things that we need to really reflect on, as Dan had mentioned, is sleep is a unique physiologic state. And sometimes we forget that when we talk to patients. And as a result of it being a unique physiologic state, there are vulnerabilities that exist in sleep. Sleep disruption certainly impacts health. Insufficient sleep impacts health. And then probably one of the more common problems that we deal with, obstructive sleep apnea in the clinic, affects both quantity and quality of sleep, and also has some unique impact on cardiovascular risk that Dan had alluded to. And I think this really comes back to the whole notion of homeostasis. You know, there has to be a balance with diet, exercise, and sleep for a healthy life if one is going to have a wellness prescription. So Dan had mentioned that the apnea-hypopnea index is not ideal, and just drilling down in terms of the research agenda now, we've historically characterized the apnea-hypopnea index as measuring just different events, and here is what our standard metric would be: none, mild, moderate, and severe. But we're really learning more how to quantitate this severity. So in this panel here, what you see is data from sleep studies in which the apnea-hypopnea index is 45 in all 3 different instances. But you can see, if you look at the burden of hypoxemia, which is probably quite important in terms of determining cardiovascular risk, patient A versus patient C, this is oximetry, you can see very, very different physiologic impact. And this is a recent paper that really tried to tease out how we associate metabolic and cardiovascular risk related to severity of sleep apnea, and whether we describe it, the desaturation as 4%, 2%, the duration of desaturation, the respiratory event duration, or the time below 90%, may all have different implications on disturbed physiology and subsequent cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes. And sleepiness is also something that we've also learned to understand as a significant impact on who to treat in terms of approaching patients in a personalized fashion. And this is just a recent study that the Harvard group looked at two NIH data sets, Mr. Oss and the Sleep Heart Health Study, and looked in a slightly different way of looking at the burden of hypoxemia as the area under the curve, or the percent oxygen desaturation. And as you can see, if you measure not only the number of dips, but the area under the curve, which gives you a hypoxic burden, there is nice separation in terms of the impact of hypoxemia on survival over time. And these are data that the Penn group has been very interested in and replicated in now a number of different populations, looking at the impact of daytime sleepiness, so the symptom subtype, in association with severity of sleep apnea and how that impacts on cardiovascular risk. So important when we're trying to decide who to treat. And then finally, Dan alluded to the whole notion of circadian rhythm, and this is a recent study from the European Society of Cardiology, European Heart Journal, called the Hygiena study, where just by simply prescribing antihypertensive therapy, either at night or upon awakening, has different impact on combined cardiovascular risk over time, followed over a 12-year period. So these are things that we frequently as clinicians don't think about, but probably have to address when one is thinking about sleep as a specific physiologic state that we may very well ignore. So I'll stop and probably move on to the rest of the panel.
Wayne, I'll pull up your slide here. A view from the trenches and your national awareness of this issue among patients and things for the research agenda.
Yeah, so I actually find it a little humorous that I'm on a sleep panel because I'm not a sleep expert at all.
That's why we put you on it.
I'm personally challenged by it, but my training is in family medicine and preventive medicine, and I consider myself a lifestyle medicine physician now. I do primary care with a lifestyle medicine flavor, and so I do deal with sleep all the time. In fact, when my slide gets up, we have this triangle that we use to describe lifestyle medicine in our practice, and the triangle has lifestyle medicine as the foundation of all the healthcare that we do, and it has 4 pillars. You know, in this panel or in this group today, this conference today, we're talking about 6 pillars, but we've sort of narrowed it down to 4, and we actually put sleep and stress together in a pillar called resilience. And that's because, in my experience, working with patients, if there's a sleep challenge, almost always there's a stress challenge associated with it. What I put up on this slide is the 9 lifestyle medicine modifications that we use with our patients. So these are sort of non-drug behavioral modification kinds of things that people can do. But what I want to emphasize is that number 9, this idea of having times of mindfulness, times of meditation, those kinds of things, to me, that's the most important thing that I do. And when I talk with my patients, if you look at those 4 pillars, nutrition is what we talk about the most. I mean, that's what people are interested in. There's a lot of win there. But mindfulness and sleep challenges and stress challenges, that's absolutely the second thing that we talk about the most. We talk about physical activity. I tell people that's the best thing that they can do to stay young longer. But as far as what we have our conversations about, it's nutrition, and it's this idea of mindfulness, stress, and all. And in my experience, my patients who are challenged with sleep, it's not just a majority of them that it's related to stress. It's a super majority. It's like 90 to 95% of them, seriously. So if we can help them with stress, their sleep patterns get way better. And so that's just sort of, again, in the trenches. That's my experience. And we have a lot of data that shows, you know, the Herbert Benson's book's been around a long time, a lot of data around the importance of mindfulness and meditation and those kinds of things with sleep. So from a lifestyle medicine sort of in the trenches perspective, I think that's where our research needs to be, is how do we make that connection, and how do we help people just as an example, the whole shutting off your blue lights. I have patients where that works really well, but guess why it works? It works because they're slowing their mind down for an hour or 2 before they go to bed. I mean, I'm sure the blue light makes a difference too, but we've got to figure out ways of having quieter minds. It's a huge challenge for our society.
Anne, please.
Good morning. So I'm a surprise guest. It's a surprise to me too to be on the panel, but it's a pleasure. I'm a professor of psychiatry, but I'm currently on leave. So my conflict of interest disclosure is that I am the CEO and I own a company in digital sleep therapeutics. So with that said, I've trained here in Pittsburgh, University of Montreal before that, and I've been in clinical sleep research for 25 years. So a few points to follow up on Dan's presentation and some of the other points that have been made. I think this idea that, and Dan demonstrated that very clearly, that you have sleep really covering the entire, sleep health and circadian health covering the entire spectrum from health really performance all the way into disease, and how it is a modifiable risk factor of disease by a number of behavioral interventions. I think it is critical that not only we make sleep and circadian health part of the curriculum of training in lifestyle medicine, but more generally in any kind of health sciences, especially when there's a practical implications to it. I want to actually debate the idea that stress, or maybe not debate, but also bring up an alternative to the idea that stress is certainly very prominent as a precipitant of sleep disturbances. But I would also argue that once you start sleeping poorly, it takes a life of its own, and that makes stress be perceived or experienced much worse than it would if sleep was actually preserved. So it may be that, health is a 24-hour issue, as Dan demonstrated very clearly. So having interventions that target both the daytime as well as the nighttime aspects of health is critical, I think, in the long term, to be able to have not only to improve health on a short term, but to sustain it over time and get the full benefits of it. And that also brings me to a point that a previous panelist made, that the point about engagement. Yes, physical activity, nutrition, sleep, it just makes sense. It's common sense. We all do it. We all think we know how to do it right, and I would debate that this is not necessarily the case, but that I forgot my point. I had 2 points on this. I forgot the first one. But regarding the previous panelist, the idea of engagement. We can't it's unlikely that we'll spend 10 hours a day thinking about and implementing physical activity, healthy nutrition, taking the time to cook really healthy meals, and dedicate 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night. So the question becomes, what are the key pain points that can be addressed with different types of intervention at the individual, the group, the societal, and the public health levels to try to facilitate it. When we put too much of the responsibility on the individual, I think we're really playing against ourselves and trying to implement and sustain those lifetime changes over time, and that there's an environmental or different environmental factors that can really contribute to making this the habit, that the default habits then become healthy habits in terms of sleep, physical activity, and nutrition. So I'll stop here.
Brilliant, thank you. Comments or questions from colleagues? I put up Dan's recommended research areas here to keep them front and center as we discuss what might be likely. And I also might challenge all of us as thinkers, who would be the likely recipients to be interested in doing this type of research, either that's non-traditional, it's across multiple health behaviors or risk factors. I'm reminded, Dan, from your talk, what I was told, you can't fool Mother Nature. Circadian rhythm is hardwired over hundreds of millions of years, probably. It's not overcome easily, and we ignore it at our risk, and we have. So that was my take home. Jorn.
Yes, I want to thank everyone on the panel for making excellent points. I'd like to make 2 points. The first one is, Dr. Dysinger used the word trenches, and Dr. Germain was just now a participant in a meeting that we've just had that just culminated the last 2 days, which was a Department of Defense-centric human performance enhancement meeting. And I think that, first of all, we extended the invitation to attendees of that meeting to attend, and some of them are here. I'd like to encourage them to come up, because I think a lot of the themes that have been brought up will be quite relevant to the issues we were all discussing. So I'd like to stimulate some input, perhaps, because as we discussed at that meeting, the population that we're talking about here, at some point or another in its life, maybe when it's 18 and it's a sleep-deprived teenager who's also been concussed a couple of times, or perhaps older, they join the military. And then whatever history of problems they do or don't have with sleep or exercise or nutrition, they bring with them into that environment, and that itself creates additional changes and modifications. The other thing I'd like to note is, so we're very interested now in circadian rhythms and the work we do. Mike mentioned that we work in trauma, sepsis, wound healing as well. We just published a paper in Frontiers in Immunology that I think for the first time shows that if you're a trauma victim, so blunt trauma, if you are injured during the night, you do worse than if you are injured during the day. There have been some studies that had suggested this from animals, but we we were the first, I think, to show this in humans. And importantly, we showed that there are distinct and different dynamic networks of inflammatory mediators, suggestion of a differential immune and inflammatory profile that happens. And so I think that the piece that we also have to think about is that, again, you bring the disruptions in your sleep maybe to the way you are driving your car, and then maybe that's when you crash your car at night, maybe, and then when you get admitted into a health system that has its own issues with its own shift workers at night, and then on top of that, the circadian rhythms are possibly setting you up for doing worse at night. So that's like a perfect storm of problems if, again, because we've been talking about the normal lifestyle issues in terms of you're just going through your life, but at some point, perhaps some number of people in their lives are going to experience an injury, a severe infection, et cetera, and these things are going to come into play as well.
Circadian compounded. Steve.
Fantastic panel. I wanted to just follow up on Wayne's point, which hit me in a way that I haven't thought about before. When he talked about it might not just be in terms of shutting off your device, getting rid of the blue light, but actually quieting the brain, I think was the phrase Wayne used. And I wonder in terms of a research agenda whether there's something a little more nuanced about that in our current society that might be important to incorporate into the research. We live in this 24-hour news cycle. People are really hyper-stimulated, where there is no break. There's this constant expectation that you're checking your email, you're checking your, whatever, and that you have no time off compared to, say, the 19th century agrarian society where you're farming during the day and at night you've got candlelit rooms and you have that quiet for the brain. To what extent in our research agenda do we need to sort of modernize the contextual circumstances that we're currently living with to understand what's driving this disruption in our sleep and potential interventions? I don't know what that would be to try to reduce this hyperstimulation that we experience now.
I think it's a much better point than any answer I can give to it. So again, I think you're right. The fact is that our biology evolved in one world and we live in another one. And we've had nowhere near enough time for evolution to catch up. So our brains and our circadian systems could give a hoot for CNN or Fox News or anything else at 2 in the morning. Your brain knows what it wants, your body knows what it needs, and trying to sort of pull people back from the possibilities of modern life into something that's more coherent with our evolutionary biology. I mean, that's the challenge, and I don't know the answer to that. Again, you can, to mix metaphors, I mean, you can't turn back the clock of progress, but in a sense, that's what our circadian system would like for us to do.
Please, Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Liebschutz, and I have two sort of separate points from two interests that I have. So the first one is after lunch, I guess when our cortisol is low or higher, I don't know, whatever, our circadian rhythms, so hopefully we'll be awake for our panel on addiction. But one thing that no one has mentioned really is the effect of substances on sleep, and I would put a call out. I do a lot of clinical addiction work, and maybe, sleep is definitely a major issue, both with opioids and also with cocaine and stimulants, and would love to think anybody here who's interested in maybe collaborating or doing some pilot work. So that's my first shout out. And my second one is my area of physician wellness, and really clinician wellness, and thinking about whether we want to think anybody UPMC or Pitt involved here. I would love to collaborate and think about improving the sleep quality that our clinicians get, and I love that diagram with the concentric circles, and maybe you're local, I'm local, Pat's, and maybe we could think about doing something together with our wellness committee. We have a lot of survey data of over 3,000 UPMC physicians, and one of the things we looked at was sleep, and it's inversely associated with fulfillment, it's linearly associated with burnout, and would love to think about, and this was mentioned, about collaborating. So 2 shout outs here, happy to go on or talk later, but if anybody else is interested, I'm interested in collaborating on those things.
Can I just add to the timing of the use of substances? I work with military personnel a lot, so alcohol is one of the main reasons for alcohol misuse is actually trying to get to sleep when you want to sleep and using different kinds of stimulants to try to be awake, so the upper and downers kind of regimens that they get into. And I would say even looking at cannabis as well and how widely used it is, one of the primary reasons why people use it is sleep, and we're definitely lagging in this area. So maybe one area for research is to look into the effects in how people use it to facilitate sleep.
So these are excellent points. If I could just add on to that, in addition to substances disrupting sleep and circadian rhythms, an area that we are actually investigating is the influence of circadian rhythms on substance use, because reward function in the brain shows very clear circadian variation. In fact, people's propensity for taking any substance, for ingesting a substance, varies by time of day and by sleep-wake state. Right. So an individual who is sleep deprived is going to have poor prefrontal control over their reward seeking, and their positive affect is going to be peaking at the end of the day. So there are some interesting bidirectional interactions. We can talk about the physician wellness thing.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we've all touched on is from a societal perspective and from a human performance perspective in the military, insufficient sleep is probably one of the main targets that we can address. And unfortunately, in the military and also in the physician workforce, sleep is not valued, and it has many consequences, such as poor decision making. Dan briefly alluded to the fact of how that affects appetite, which can actually impact the obesity epidemic. So if one's talking about trying to address, the patient as, a whole person, not assessing insufficient sleep is a very important thing in my clinical practice. That's one of the things that frequently is underlying much of the problems that patients come to see us for. I presume our wellness expert would agree.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that poor sleep underlies an awful lot of issues. But I just wanted to point out in the whole substance thing, again, I'm not a sleep expert, but for those who are sleep experts, my understanding is it's not just sort of alcohol and marijuana, it's actually Ambien and Xanax and those kind of things. And again, I look to the sleep experts, but my understanding is there's no drug out there, and there's really not much in the way of supplements out there that really help quality of sleep. Is that?
Yeah, complicated question. I think over the short-term, medications can have positive effects, I think, but clearly there are side effects that need to be reckoned with, and duration of use is something that needs to be reckoned with as well.
Yeah, and so that goes along with clinically, I do use drugs to help people sleep, but it's short-term to change a cycle to some of the other things. And but the point is, lifestyle medicine is the answer to long-term sort of bigger societal issues. It's not drugs and substances.
Let's wrap up with one with Dexter. But again, I'm going to give a plug. Jane and I are colleagues on the physician resilience effort at UPMC. There's not a single one of you here at every one of your institutions that doesn't have that similar challenge. And learning best practices around healthy lifestyle habits for the physicians who practice these and do these actually have better patient outcomes because of those types of things. What can we do to build our skills, Eddie and others in this room? To that end, Dexter is the current president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and actually he and I first met at the AMA around addiction medicine in the AMA Section Council. So very timely, you should come up following Jane's question. But Dexter, go ahead.
Great panel. I have two comments and then a plea. The first comment is personal. The second one is more professional related. The first one is that I've done really so well now in sleep. I can really appreciate it. But I've gotten so good at it that I can do it with my eyes closed. Oh, don't. That's not a personal one. On a professional level, And while we could really get them to see all of the good things about lifestyle medicine, including sleep, and they really resonated around sleep because we could show them the safety data that with a lack of sleep, how this leads to accidents and drives their OSHA scores and things like that. Unfortunately, they were able to adopt many of the other things, diet, physical activity, and those kinds of things. But when they looked at the workflow around sleep, again, these are large global organizations. They're running plants on 3 cycles a day. They're on conference calls with Asia and Australia and South Africa and Europe. You see what I'm saying? That there really is no way to work these kinds of remedies into their workflow. And so my plea to this group is if anyone has those kinds of relationships or setups where we can sort of use best practice as to what works and how to help these organizations, that's really needed. So we need to do more than just talk about the science. I think we're starting to get that, but how do we actually implement this? This goes back to maybe the translational piece of this, but there's a real need for it, and there's a real interest for it. I think there's an opportunity. So I just wanted to put that down on the table. Thank you.
I can tell you, sir, that there are some efforts that are that can be translated from military practices because they're global, because it's 24/7, because of these. So I think there are a number of good science, but also practices that could be translated to the manufacturing. I can talk with you about that. Yes.
But it also leads us, Ann, to think about other targets for this report that might be NIOSH, that might be, which is the Total Worker Health Initiative, what optimize health protection and health promotion. Well, without restorative sleep, guess what? You ain't going to have it, right? So there's a different way to frame some of the reports from the white papers we put out and the target audiences that Dexter raised here. Let's give a round of applause to the panel and to Dr. Buysse.